Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. Today, Sauber F1 Team have released pictures of their new 2017 Formula One challenger, the C36. Sauber are the first team officially to unveil their car. We have seen the Williams FW14 in a computer rendering. However, Sauber are the first team to release actual photographs of their new championship challenger. Sauber are hoping that the C36 will bring with it a change in the team's fortunes. Of course, Sauber, a consistent midfield runner through most of their existence, have run into some hard times in recent years. On this first shot, we can see a front three-quarter view of the car. The first thing that strikes us about it, quite simply, that livery. Look at it. It's blue, it's white, and we've got some gold accents there. Now, the last time that we saw copious amounts of gold on a Formula One car was probably from Lotus in 2014, and of course they were doing a play on the very famous John Player livery that Lotus ran in their real guys in the 1980s. However, this livery is different entirely. It's predominantly blue and white, and those are very high contrasting colors. The Saubers are going to be very easy to identify on track this year. But that gold accent, you see it first of all on the front wing, in the adjustable sections of the wing, the cascade elements and the flaps, but those pinstripes of gold also go all the way down the car on each side of the center line, and they terminate all the way back on the rear wing end plates. So absolutely wonderful livery, first and foremost on this car. I love it. In terms of technical details on the car, it's usually a little difficult to divine technical innovations, technical specs, anything like that from a launch spec picture of a Formula One car, simply because the teams try their best to hide as much detail as possible, even though they have the car sitting right there in plain sight in front of us, being looked at by hundreds of millions of people, most likely. So these launch spec pictures, the cars probably will differ somewhat in their appearance in launch spec versus how they roll out of the pit lane in Barcelona next week, and certainly how they're going to roll out of the pit lane for Free Practice 1 in Australia on the 26th of March when the Grand Prix is. However, what we can divine from these pictures is a little bit interesting, and I just want to talk a little bit about what I see and maybe how the car is going to stack up relative to Sauber's previous competition history, as well as to what we can expect to see from the rest of the grid. As I mentioned before, the shot we have before us, this front three-quarter view, we can see a very nice semi-profile, semi-front end look at the car. First of all, we can see the front nose, very similar to the nose that Sauber and Williams were running since 2014. I'm not so thrilled that some of the teams have elected to keep that little appendage that's sticking out of the front of the car. I don't necessarily think it's mandatory to run this, although the height of the nose is homologated now in the regulations. It's for the crash tests. It's to make sure that in the event of a 90-degree perpendicular accident, as you might call it, T-boning, they are trying to ensure that the nose section of a car will not penetrate the side of another car and cause a dangerous situation, maybe burst a radiator, or at the very worst case, penetrate into the cockpit and harm a driver. So that's why we have these low noses nowadays. But you can see they've retained that little thumbnail sort of appendage there, and it's replete with the Sauber logo, as you might expect. You can also see the front wing mounted on pylons, as we've been seeing for decades now in Formula One, and those pylons are spaced out a little bit from the very tip of the nose. This is obviously to channel air underneath the car and try to feed the center section of the front end where the T-tray is, as well as to feed the side pods and ultimately the diffuser. Looking at the front wing, you can see that delta shape that has been so hyped up in the months leading up to the 2017 season. I have to say, it's somewhat subtle, but at the same time it does make an overall visual impact. I like the way it looks. And looking at the cascade elements, for a launch spec wing, this is a very complex design. And I don't know if it's derived from a 2015 or 2016 spec wing from Sauber. It probably is, but at the same time, the wing does retain that delta shape, which is all new for this year. I'm absolutely loving it. Moving across the front axle, we see something that looks pretty conventional as far as Formula One goes. We obviously have a pushrod suspension layout. You can see the brake ducts mounted on either side, very conventional there. The suspension pickup points, it all looks very pedestrian by modern Formula One standards. You can also see the front of the chassis here, not talking about the nose section, but the front of the chassis itself where the nose attaches. You can see a very steep slope downward to the nose attach point. This also is homologated in the regulations, and again, it's just to prevent cockpit penetration in the event of a 90-degree perpendicular impact with another car. Midships around the cockpit area, here's where things start to get a little bit interesting. First of all, on top side, you can see the mirrors, very conventional location, but they are painted that nice fluorescent gold. Absolutely loving that, and Sauber certainly using the opportunity to exploit some more sponsorship billboard space, so you can see some sponsorship graphics on the mirrors. Moving to the sides here, we can look at the right side of the car, which is screen left for us, and you can see the radiator inlet. Looks very conventional in comparison to how Sauber have been doing it, particularly if we go back to 2013. Of course, that was a V8 powered car, but you can see the shape of the side pod inlet very similar to what they have been running, and in terms of the relative size, it looks very similar as well. Moving more outboard, however, we can see these turning vanes. Now, in 2017, I'm under the impression anyway that these turning vanes are supposed to be angled backward, and it's difficult to tell from this particular shot anyway if that is the case. With these launch spec pictures, it is entirely possible that they have fitted old parts to the car just to try and hide their latest designs, and particularly when it comes to small aero details, but it's possible that that is angled backwards here. Again, I can't really tell from this shot, but you can see the turning vane. Moving slightly forward and further down still from there, you can see a barge board. It's been a long time since we've seen an actual barge board in Formula 1. 2015 and 2016, Mercedes were running these very gruesome-looking serrated barge board type devices along the sides of their chassis in front of the radiator inlets, but now actual barge boards are back, and Sauber are running them, and they've painted them bright blue. Come at me, guys, is what they're saying. Absolutely love it. Glad to see real barge boards back in Formula 1. Just to rears of the cockpit, you can see the air snorkel there, the intake for the engine. Sauber have done something very interesting with this. They have split that air intake, much like Mercedes did at the start of the European season in 2010. They decided to run that blade roll hoop and then split the air intake. That is absolutely glorious. I think it is a design that is so underused in Formula 1. I think it looks fantastic, and I'm glad that Sauber have decided to go in that direction with their air intake. I'm not entirely sure what the advantages are to running that configuration of snorkel, but I think it looks great. I'm sure that as the flow goes down into the air intake, it's able to split off in a couple of different directions. One side's mostly for engine intake, I'm assuming, and another side maybe for cooling, probably for the gearbox or potentially the turbo, but certainly I love that design. Also, moving further rear still, we can see in bare carbon at the moment a shark fin. These shark fins started to come into Formula 1 in testing in 2007, and then they were on the race cars in 2008. The idea behind a shark fin, very simply, you want to induce positive pressure laterally on the car through a corner. And Le Mans, particularly in LMP1, pretty much every LMP1 car now has a shark fin. This was an idea that was trialed in Formula 1, and again, just trying to control the car's attitude in yaw around a corner, just to get a little bit more positive pressure there to resist some oversteer forces, so you can run the rear end a little bit more loosely. Moving toward the rear end there, you can see the rear wing, and you can see a very interesting arrangement for the DRS actuator. DRS retained in 2017 in Formula 1. However, these larger and lower rear wings have probably necessitated a rather substantial redesign of the DRS in terms of how it actually operates. So you can see Sauber there running a very large hydraulic stay that is obviously supporting the rear wing first of all, but beyond that it is housing all of the hydraulic lines and actuators that are needed to move that flap up and down to actuate DRS. We can move here to our next shot, and on this next shot we see a front end view of the car. We can see that front wing in full detail as well as that front nose, and then moving up and rearward on the car, you can see that split air intake in all of its glory. Again, absolutely loving that design. And obviously, as you can see, to make that work, they have had to incorporate another blade-style roll bar, similar to how Mercedes did it in 2010. Absolutely love it. We can get a better look from this angle of the front suspension layout. It's very traditional, double wishbone and push rod going up there at about 40-45 degrees into the top of the chassis. Very nice. You can also get a little bit better look at those barge boards. You can see they're a very simple overall barge board design. Very evocative of the Ferrari F2004, I must say. And then you can look back further still on the car and see the side pod radiator inlets. Not entirely sure if they have fitted the radiators in the car. I assume they probably have. I think I can see just maybe some radiators peeking out in there, but some indication perhaps of how Sauber have got their radiators configured in those side pods. Very nice shot indeed. And now we pull slightly away and we change our angle quite substantially to have a look at the entire car once again from above and also still from the front. We can get a better look at those barge boards now towards the center section of the car, and you can see the overall placement and spacing with everything. Those turning vanes on either sides of the side pods, you can see that there's quite a bit of gap between the side of the turning vane and the actual side pod. So Sauber are clearly going after a lot of air being funneled through the car's midsection, and those turning vanes, the way that they're angled, clearly they are going to try and funnel air toward the rear wing with those turning vanes. And you see how they cut in quite sharply, again at about a 45-degree angle as you go lower down on the car. That's to feed the floor and feed the diffuser for sure. So Sauber definitely going very aggressively with their rear end treatment, it looks, at least from these launch spec pictures. You get a little bit better sense of the proportions of the front wing from here. And again, I'm absolutely floored at how complex this design is in launch spec. This wing has to be designed after a 2016 or 2015 wing, and they've just reprofiled it for that delta section, because I can't believe that they would have something this complicated already, given that we have new aero regulations in Formula 1, and nobody's quite sure how the cars are going to follow nose to tail. But clearly, Sauber's design team and their wonderful wind tunnel facilities and their supercomputers, they've been chugging away in the winter, and they have given us this design. Sauber certainly, I would say, a somewhat radical approach so far. And again, like I said at the beginning, they are hoping that this car changes their fortunes in Formula 1. And on this next shot here, we have a side view shooting the right side of the car, and you can see overall the overall plan in terms of the wheelbase and things like that. I'm correct with my assumption that those turning vanes are not angled back. And again, I'm a little shady on my technical regs in terms of if those turning vanes have to be angled rearward. I saw rearward angled turning vanes in every hypothetical rendering of a 2017 car. However, this is the first time we're seeing an actual 2017 car in launch spec, and we don't have them. So again, I wonder if Sauber are just playing a little bit of trickery here. But you can see that livery, how intricate it is toward the midsection of the car along the engine cover. That blue sort of dips down to meet almost to the reference plane along the edge of the side pod there. Absolutely loving it. And also, I want to point out, you can see 25 years in Formula 1 written on the side of the engine cover there. This is Sauber's 25th anniversary competing in top-level motorsport. Absolutely love to have Sauber on the grid. I was very sad when BMW bought out Sauber at the end of 2005, because I was always a Sauber fan. I loved their cars. They always had good drivers. Many of their drivers went on to achieve great things. I'm talking about Felipe Massa, and I loved their livery, that blue, white, and yellow livery. The cars just looked fun, and they were pretty in terms of aerodynamic designs as well. So certainly. And about great drivers driving for Sauber, Kimi Räikkönen. He made his Formula 1 debut with Sauber, and he went on to become world champion. Felipe Massa, of course, was probably the shortest-lived world champion with a reign of about 30 seconds. But again, Räikkönen and Massa coming from Sauber. Sauber are a team that I very much love to see on the grid, and hopefully they will remain there for another 25 years. Also from this shot, you can see two more very important details. Actually, three if we count the barge boards. You can see, first of all, to the barge boards, you can see that they have a front section that is up vertically quite a bit above the rest of the barge board, and I'm not entirely sure what they're doing here. It reminds me a little bit of those canard wings that teams like Ferrari and McLaren ran on the front section of their car in 2007 and 2008. Perhaps they are trying to funnel air into the radiators with that. Also, you can see the camera mount just to the left of the front wheel. You can see a camera mount there and that little winglet, but it looks like the flow from that camera mount is going to interact with the top of that barge board. So perhaps some funneling of air toward the side pod inlets, but also potentially trying to capture some of that flow, which would be at high pressure, off of that camera mount, and then start to turn it around with the barge board and funnel it around the front section of the car to get it back in again as the air continues to flow to the rear. The other detail I want to talk about is the shark fin. You can see the profile of that shark fin. It looks almost identical to what Ferrari were running on the F2008, similar in terms of the car's overall proportions, of course. And of course, if we even look more recently to the Ferrari F10, we see another similar shark fin. Of course, on the F10, the shark fin was attached to the rear wing. Of course, no DRS in that era, and teams like McLaren, who also ran a shark fin, used it to house the now infamous F duct. But that shark fin is back, and the same rationale that I talked about before, just control the car's attitude in yaw around the corners. Last detail I want to talk about from this shot is the rear wing. You can see the rear wing end plates are angled back, as we have seen on all hypothetical renderings of 2017 cars to date, and you can see clearly they have been doing some work aerodynamically with that as well, not only in the overall shape and placement, but you can see those gills cut into the sides of those rear wing end fences just to help control the air that is spilling out from the sides of that rear wing. Again, you don't want to overpressure things because you'll end up in a high angle of attack stall on the rear wing, which will completely negate its effectiveness, and no rear downforce in a Formula 1 car is a big problem. So that's just to control that. And the last shot we have here, just a rear three-quarter view of the car. And again, pretty much the same details that we've been able to make out from the other shots, but just a slightly different angle on them. Particularly, you can see more of the rear wing in this shot. Two things that I've noticed on the rear wing just by looking at it for a few minutes. You can see that there is not quite a gurney flap on it, but you can see how in the center of the rear wing, the main element of the rear wing, there's a little bit of a depression there separating the two sides of the flaps. This is most likely to accommodate the DRS actuator arm. The actuator itself will be housed inside that bulbous section on top of that pillar that goes to the rear wing and attaches to the main flap, the main plane on the rear wing, but most likely that's just to accommodate the mounting bracket there and the linkage. Also on the rear wing end plates, if you look at the bottom just underneath the CNBC logo, you can see more gills cut into the sides of the end plates there. Again, that's just to clean up some of the turbulent air that comes off of the tires and probably a little bit of overspill from the top of the floor section as well. We've seen this on many Formula 1 cars past and probably more present as well, so that is not a surprising feature to see at all. All in all, though, I have to say Sauber, first of all, their livery, it is very striking, and the car's overall design, at least what we're able to divine of it in these launch spec pictures, certainly quite radical and quite striking, and I'm optimistic in terms of aero, in terms of Sauber's performance. However, when we talk about the power plant, Sauber are going to be running 2016 spec Ferrari engines, and if we look at the packaging of the rear end, and perhaps we should go back to our other shot from the beginning to take a better look at that rear end packaging. We don't really have a good shot of the rear, which of course is once again on purpose, but if we go back to the first shot that we started with, you can see everything is rather wide on the rear, and Sauber running year-old Ferrari engines, we know that Ferrari have had some issues in the engine department, not really in terms of reliability so much, but in terms of out-and-out performance, they must have some packaging concerns, and Sauber clearly are forced to make their rear end a bit wider. Now, nobody really knows how things are going to go in 2017. Perhaps it may be that the rear wings and larger diffusers generate enough downforce on their own to where the rear end packaging is not quite a concern anymore, but the trend in Formula 1, really since 2008, 2009, has been to make the rear end as narrow as possible and as tightly packaged as possible. I remember in 2009 when Williams debuted their FW31, the rear end of that car was so thin that many of us were wondering how in the hell it stays together, but they were just using the gearbox as their main stressed member on the rear, and there was not much bodywork going on. Again, you just wanted to feed the diffuser back in those days. With the larger rear wings, perhaps there's going to be enough downforce generated coupled with the larger diffusers for this year to make up for somewhat larger packaging on the rear of the car. However, that remains to be seen until we get cars on track, and really we won't see the real ramifications of this until we see cars on track in Australia. But at any rate, that is the Sauber C36, and I certainly hope that you enjoyed my very uneducated and very quick take on the car. Hopefully I'll be able to do more videos on 2017 launch spec releases when we get them, and we're going to be getting quite a few of them this week and next, so stay tuned for that. For Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.